Okay. So, you've been sending in, you sent us a bunch of materials about audits and, all this stuff about quality. And it really makes you think, like, about all the work that goes on behind the scenes, right? All this work that we never even think about to make sure that the products we use every day actually, like, meet the standards, right? So today I thought it'd be really cool to sort of zero in on what happens after an audit. Like, what are those, like, essential next steps?
Yeah.
And specifically, we're going to talk about how organizations look at the audit findings and then put those corrective and preventative actions into place. Or, CAPA, as we all know and love it, it's like detective work, but for quality assurance.
Exactly. You've given us so much information, like a huge amount from all those regulations, like 21 CFR parts 110 and 111 to practical guides on GMPs. And I think what we really want to do in this deep dive is uncover those core principles, right? How do companies actually analyze those audit results?
Yeah.
And then how do they implement an effective CAPA? I mean, I think we want to shed light on the whole process, how they figure out what the problems are, why those problems happen in the first place, and then most importantly, how they make sure that those problems don't ever happen again.
Right, right.
And we don't want to get too bogged down in all the regulatory jargon.
No, no, absolutely not. Okay, so let's start unpacking all of this, right? We hear about audits all the time, but why are they, like, the cornerstone of ensuring quality? Like, what makes them so important? It sounds like a really intense process.
Yeah, well, I think you can really think of audits, whether they're internal reviews or inspections by the big regulatory bodies, as vital checkups. Like, that's what they are. They're these checkups,
Yeah,
to make sure that an organization is really following the established standards and regulations.
right.
And this is something we see, this recurring theme that pops up in the sources, particularly when we're talking about cGMPs.
Yeah, the cGMPs.
And, these aren't just random rules that someone came up with. They're in place to make sure that, especially those critical products like pharmaceuticals and food, that those products, they reliably meet all the expectations for safety, efficacy, quality, everything, right? They
Yeah.
just have to.
So, I'm picturing, like, these inspectors showing up at a facility.
Right.
What are they actually looking for? It can't just be like a general, like, look around, can it?
No, 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 not at all. And some of the GMP training materials highlight inspectors are really focused. They have specific checkpoints.
Right, right.
And they are looking at adherence to best practices. And this is for the entire manufacturing journey. I mean, we're talking everything from the very basic design and how clean a facility is, which, of course, ties back into regulations like 21 CFR Part 211, Subpart C,
Right,
which, that outlines requirements for, the physical plant, the grounds, all that, to make sure that contamination doesn't happen,
right, right,
to the maintenance and calibration of equipment,
right.
which, we see emphasized in 21 CFR Part 111
Hmm.
and tons of other guidelines. They're essentially verifying that all those documented procedures intended to guarantee product quality are actually being followed in practice.
Okay. So let's say, they're going through, they're doing their thing, they spot something that isn't quite right, so it's not quite up to par.
Right.
That's where these findings come into play.
Precisely.
I imagine,
Right
right?
after an audit, any observation where, there might be a deviation from regulations or maybe the organization's own established procedures, those get documented as findings. And it's really important to remember that a finding isn't a declaration of, oh my gosh, you violated something.
Right.
It's really, I think it's really best understood as the auditor's professional observation, just saying, hey, this thing might not actually be meeting the required standards.
Right.
This needs a little bit closer attention.
Yeah.
And, we saw in the annual GMP training 2022 materials, they also mentioned how not following procedures can lead to those deviations that require follow-up.
Right. Right. That makes sense. So a finding is like a signal, right? Saying, hey, this needs a closer look.
Exactly.
What's that next step? Like, how do these organizations make sense of all these findings once they have them?
Yeah, so that's where the analysis begins.
Right.
So, once those audit findings are documented, the organization has to take a really close look at each and every one of them. And the main goal here, the primary goal, is to really understand, what does this finding actually mean?
Right.
And then how could this impact the product quality?
Yeah.
How could it affect our compliance with the regulations?
Right. Right.
And we didn't really see a like rigid categorization system,
Right.
but we can kind of infer, right,
Yeah.
that they're going to relate to the different aspects that GMPs cover.
Right. So let's break that down a little bit. Like, what are those areas that these findings might, touch on?
So thinking about the scope of GMPs, we've got the physical facility, we've
Right.
talked about the design, then there's, equipment, a huge, huge part.
Yeah.
Are instruments calibrated, maintained, like we saw in 21 CFR Part 111?
Right.
And then, of course, there's documentation,
Right. Right.
which, I mean, everyone's heard this, right? If it wasn't documented, it wasn't done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which, we heard in the annual GMP refresher training 2022,
Right.
findings oftentimes highlight those gaps or inconsistencies in record keeping.
Yeah.
And then we've got things that you might not even think about right away, like pest control,
Oh, yeah.
which we saw mentioned in 21 CFR Part 110.
Right.
So, if pest control isn't managed properly, that can lead to findings as well. Really, the key takeaway here is that each finding needs to be super carefully examined to determine what exactly went wrong and why it matters.
Yeah.
And, the FDA clinical investigator training course materials you shared, they really emphasize the importance of taking the time to do this detailed review.
Okay. So we've had our audit. We've got our findings, which are kind of like clues, right?
Yeah.
And now we get to CAPA. So what exactly is CAPA, and how does it address all these clues?
So CAPA stands for Collective and Preventive Action.
Right.
And it's this process that organizations use to address those audit findings that we've been discussing.
Right.
But more importantly, it's to stop those problems from happening again in the future. It's not just about putting on a Band-Aid. It's about saying, okay, what is the fundamental reason behind this problem?
Right.
And how do you build better systems?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So systematic process, that sounds kind of, official. Can we break that down a little bit? Like, what are the steps that are typically involved in a CAPA process?
Absolutely. So the first step, and it's the most important step, is root cause analysis.
Okay.
And this is where we dig deep. We want to understand why something happened. You can't just treat the symptoms, right?
Right.
You've got to figure out the underlying cause.
Right.
And, the observations, decisions, and actions in current good manufacturing practices material, and also in FDA regulatory affairs by Pisano, they both highlight this,
Yeah.
effective solutions. They hinge on understanding that why.
Right.
Sometimes what looks like the obvious cause, it's really just a symptom of something deeper.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. So once you figure out that why, then what? I mean, that's where the corrective action part of CAPA kicks in.
Right. So corrective actions are those immediate steps that you take
Yeah.
to fix the problem that was found during the audit.
Right. Right.
These are about putting things right now.
Okay.
So for instance, an audit uncovers a documentation error.
Right.
The corrective action is to go back, you correct that error, you make sure the record is accurate.
Right.
We saw that in the Tails Lunch and Learn.
Yeah.
Or, what if a piece of equipment was found to be outside of its calibration limits?
Right.
The corrective action is to recalibrate it. That's right in line with 21 CFR Part 111.
Right.
And, verification in that case would be making sure, after you recalibrate it, you go back, you check those calibration records, make sure that it's within the acceptable range now. It's kind of like, you repair a flat tire. You want to make sure that it holds air.
Yeah. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Address that immediate issue. But CAPA also has preventive action in the name. So how is that different than just fixing what's broken?
Right. So preventive actions, those are the ones that are looking ahead.
Yeah.
They're proactive. They're designed to stop that issue from happening again, not just in the specific instance that you found it,
Right.
but in other places too, right?
That's right.
And that's where continuous improvement comes into play. And that's something that, we see in ICHQ 914
Right.
and Pisano's FDA regulatory affairs. It's all about learning from those past experiences and then changing the systems or maybe the procedures to avoid it happening again. Validation in this case would be like you repair the tire, you brain the car for a week.
Right.
You want to make sure the problem doesn't come back.
Yeah, that makes sense. Could you give me like a concrete example, like a preventive action that might come after a corrective action?
Sure. So let's say an audit uncovers a bunch of incomplete batch records.
Okay.
So the corrective action, you'd go back and complete all those records.
Right.
But a preventive action might be to, update the training program
Right.
for the staff, right, on
Right.
how to accurately fill out batch records.
Right.
Or maybe you implement a checklist
Oh.
or even like a digital system
Oh, wow.
with prompts that guide users
Right.
and make sure that all the necessary information is recorded correctly every time.
That's really smart.
The goal here is to address the systemic weakness in the process.
Right.
That led to the errors in the first place,
Yeah.
not just to fix those individual errors.
Okay, so we've identified the root cause, we took corrective action to fix the immediate problem, and we put in place preventive measures so it doesn't happen again. What are those, like, last steps in the whole CAPA process to make sure it's all effective?
Yeah, so implementing those actions and documenting everything is key.
Okay,
All the analysis that you did, the actions you decided on, who's responsible, timelines, you've got to document all of that.
right,
I mean, remember we talked about this, in the annual GMP refresher training 2022.
right.
The key principle in GMP, if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done.
Yeah,
This documentation is like a record of the entire CAPA process. And, Subpart J of 21 CFR Part 211, they emphasize this too.
okay,
Keep detailed records of all those corrective and preventative actions.
yeah,
And it's not just about checking a box for compliance. It's also super helpful for trend analysis.
right.
You can figure out if there are recurring systemic issues.
Yeah.
And you can share that knowledge within the organization.
Right, right. You've got to show your work. But it sounds like it's more than just showing off, right?
Yeah.
So what comes after you've implemented the actions and documented everything? Like, how do you know if they've actually been successful?
Right, and that's where verification and sometimes validation come in.
Okay,
So verification is about making sure that the corrective action actually solved the problem.
right,
So, if a piece of equipment was recalibrated, you go back and look at those calibration records.
Right.
You might do some tests to confirm that the equipment is working within the specifications now.
okay,
Validation goes a little bit further.
Okay.
It's about showing that the preventive action works consistently over time,
right,
even under different conditions. So that might involve, really closely monitoring the process after you implement the preventive action.
right.
And collecting data to show that it's effective. And Blassner's establishing a cGMP laboratory audit system, and Derivage's the Certified Pharmaceutical GMP Professional Handbook, they provide a ton of insight on these follow-up steps.
So a strong CAPA system, it's not just about reacting to problems. It's a whole cycle
Yeah.
of identifying, analyzing, fixing, preventing, and then making sure those actions are actually working.
Exactly. And having a strong CAPA system, it's so important. And it's not just about looking at audit findings like they're isolated incidents.
Right.
It's about continuous improvement.
Right.
Which we saw in ICHQ 914.
Right.
And a bunch of the other sources. When you get to the root causes of issues and then you prevent them from happening again, CAPA directly enhances product quality.
Wow.
Think of it as this learning system, right? Where problems become opportunities to get better.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And it's also super important for, keeping those regulatory agencies happy, right?
Absolutely. A strong CAPA system, it's not just a good thing to have. It's essential for staying compliant with the regulations, like cGMPs. And we talked about the goal of GMPs at the beginning. It's to make sure that products are consistently safe, effective, and high quality.
Right, right.
A good CAPA system shows those regulatory bodies that the organization is serious about quality management.
Yeah.
That they have these mechanisms in place to not only fix problems, but also prevent them from happening in the first place.
So it's not just a separate thing, it's part of a bigger framework.
Exactly. CAPA is a key part of the quality management system, the QMS.
Right, the QMS.
That's all the policies, SOPs, processes, everything that an organization uses to make sure that products are consistently high quality. And, like the annual GMP training 2022 materials mentioned, the QMS is the framework and CAPA is the engine.
Wow, I like that. Okay, so this has been a really insightful deep dive
Yeah.
into analyzing audit findings and implementing CAPA.
Right.
So before we wrap up, let's recap those key takeaways for our listeners.
Sure. So we talked about how audit findings, even though they might seem negative at first, are actually super valuable opportunities for improvement.
Right.
And the most important thing to do after any audit is to analyze each finding.
Right.
Figure out what it means and how it could impact the product.
Right.
Root cause analysis is essential.
Yeah.
You can't find good solutions until you know why the problem happened.
Right.
CAPA itself includes both corrective actions, which fix the immediate problem, and preventive actions, which stop it from happening again. And documentation, so important.
Yeah.
Got to document everything. And a strong CAPA system, it's not just about reacting to mistakes, it's about continuous improvement.
Right.
It helps improve product quality and make sure you're compliant with those essential regulations like cGMPs.
Yeah, so for our listener, you've gotten this look behind the scenes into how we ensure the quality of so many products that you use every day.
Right.
And it's more than just checking boxes. It's about making things better.
Exactly. And here's something to think about.
Okay.
We've been talking about, highly regulated industries like pharmaceuticals, food, but think about those principles.
Okay.
Identifying issue, understanding the root causes, implementing those corrective and preventive actions.
Yeah.
Could you apply those in other areas?
Oh, interesting.
Maybe in your own work.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, having a structured approach to solving problems, that's valuable in any field.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree.
It's about progress and quality.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for taking this deep dive with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Until next time, keep those sources coming. We're excited to see what we uncover together.
Yeah, definitely.